Two fathers, two families, six children who should have been safe in the arms of the men they trusted most. Instead, their fathers became their executioners. Chris, what smothered and strangled his daughters Bella and Celeste, erased the unborn life of baby Nico, and buried the truth beneath layers of lies. Chad Doerman gunned down his three young sons, Clayton, Hunter, and Chase, in broad daylight, in full view of their terrified mother and horrified neighbors. These are not tales of strangers, not random tragedies, but acts of violence committed by the very people whose role in life should have been protect, guide, and nurture their children. Family annihilation always strikes at the heart of human understanding, but when the victims are children, the horror multiplies. Adults, as fragile as they may be, are still seen as participants in life's struggles. Children, however, are innocence embodied. They carry no blame, no part in marital tensions, no role in affairs or personal failures. They are simply children, existing to love and be loved. When a father turns against his own children, the betrayal is total. It cuts against everything instinctual about being human. Chris Watts and Chad Doerman could not have been more different in the ways they carried out their crimes. One smothered his daughters in the dark silence of a house in Colorado. The other sprayed bullets in an Ohio neighborhood with the violence of thunder. But the core of their stories is the same. They destroyed the children who trusted them most. To understand the weight of these crimes, we must step back to life before the murders. Before August 2018, the Watts family looked perfect outsiders. Shanann, who was pregnant with her third child, filled her social media with happy updates. There were videos of Bella singing to her mother, clips of Cece running across the room in laughter, snapshots of Chris holding his daughters and playing the role of doting dad. Friends admired the marriage. Neighbors saw a young family in love. Shanann often described how blessed she felt to have two beautiful daughters and another child on the way. But the truth was much darker. Chris was not the man the world thought he was. He had withdrawn from Shanann emotionally and physically. He was having an affair with Nicole Kessinger, a relationship that gave him the illusion of freedom, adventure, and possibility. To Chris, the life he had built with Shanann was no longer a joy, but a trap. The children he had fathered, once paraded as proof of his family man persona, had become symbols of responsibility he wanted to shed. This is the first contrast between Shanann and Chris. For Shanann, Bella and Cece were her heart. She adored them, cherished them, devoted her time and energy to making them happy. For Chris, they became obstacles. To Shanann, Nico represented new life and hope. To Chris, Nico represented another burden. That gulf in perspective is what turned fantasy into murder. The Doermans, living in Ohio, seemed at first glance like another struggling but ordinary family. Their three boys, Clayton, Hunter, and Chase, were active, full of life, and inseparable. The brothers argued, laughed, and played together in the way siblings do, bound by love that could never be broken by childish squabbles. Clayton, the oldest, carried a natural role of protector, guiding his younger brothers. Hunter, the middle child, was energetic and loving, the bridge between oldest and youngest. Chase, the baby, was adored by them both, the spark of innocence that completed the trio. Neighbors saw the boys outside, riding bikes, playing games, being children. They were the sounds of life in the neighborhood, voices carrying across yards as they invented adventures and bonded as brothers. Their mother loved them fiercely, her life revolving around their well-being. But Chad Doerman was a man collapsing inward. He was unstable, unpredictable, carrying thoughts so dark that even those closest to him could not predict the horror he would unleash. Unlike Chris, who wore a mask of calm deceit, Chad's volatility was visible. He yelled, he brooded. He carried storms inside him. His children lived under that shadow, but no child, not Clayton, not Hunter, not Chase, could ever imagine that their father's anger would turn into their execution. When we return to Colorado, we see Bella Watts, just 4 years old, already showing the instincts of a caretaker. In videos, she cradled her sister, comforted her, sang songs with the sweetness of a child who loved deeply. She adored her father. To Bella, Chris was strong, reliable, the man who lifted her high into the air and carried her on his shoulders. That unconditional love is what makes her betrayal all the more devastating. Bella was not too young to understand fear. At 4 years old, she could sense danger. She knew when something was wrong. And when Chris pressed his hands around her, she resisted. She fought for her life. The autopsy later revealed injuries to her tongue, signs of her desperate struggle for air. Bella's final moments were not silent acceptance. They were a child's desperate fight to live. And she knew, she must have known, that the person taking her breath away was her own father. This truth makes her story one of the most haunting in modern crime. A little girl, who should have been safe in her father's arms, spent her last seconds resisting his betrayal. Bella's courage shines through even in tragedy. In that tiny body was a will to live that eclipsed her father's cowardice. She showed more strength in her final breath than Chris showed in his entire life. Bella's legacy is not only one of loss, but of courage, a reminder that even a child betrayed by love fought to survive. Her sister Celeste, or Cece, was younger, only 3 years old. She was still wrapped in the pure innocence of toddlerhood. She didn't understand deception. She didn't know about her father's affair or his distance from Shannon. To her, Chris was daddy, nothing more, nothing less. He was a man who played with her, carried her, kissed her goodnight. Her life was one of joy and laughter, filled with trust in her parents. When Chris turned on Cece, she did not resist as Bella had. She was too young, too small, too trusting. Her death carried the cruelty of confusion. She must have wondered why her father, the man who loved her, was hurting her. That incomprehension is perhaps the deepest cruelty of her story. To die not only in fear but in confusion, realizing too late that the person you trusted most has become the source of danger, that is a level of betrayal beyond imagination. And then there was baby Nico, still in Shanann's womb, months away from his first breath. Shanann's joy at carrying him radiated from every word she spoke. She believed Nico would complete her family. He represented a new beginning, the promise of life yet to come. To Chris, however, Nico was not hope. He was another tie, another weight. By killing Shannon, Chris killed Nico too. His crime was not only against the living, but against the unborn, not only against the present, but against the future. Nico's name is a reminder of what Chris stole, not just lives, but possibilities. He never cried, never laughed, never played. His life ended before it began. And in that erasure, we see the full depth of Chris's betrayal. It was not only about rejecting the life he had. It was about destroying the future his family was meant to have. Meanwhile, in Ohio, the Doerman boys carried on with life, unaware of the storm building inside their father. Clayton, as the oldest, had begun to take on the protective role, looking after Hunter and Chase. He was still a child himself, but he carried responsibility in the way older siblings often do. Hunter was playful, energetic, loving, the middle child who connected with both older and younger. And Chase, the youngest, carried innocence in its purest form. He was adored, the light of the family. Together, they were the picture of boyhood innocence, of brothers bound for life. But on June 15th, 2023, Chad Doerman shattered that bond. He raised a rifle in broad daylight. He didn't wait for silence or a cover of night. He acted in front of his wife, his neighbors, his community. The boys screamed. They ran. They tried to escape. Reports say one even tried to protect the others, stepping in front of his brothers in a final act of love. That moment is seared into memory, a child showing more courage in seconds than his father showed in his entire life. The sound of gunfire tore through the neighborhood. Neighbors heard it. Their mother watched in horror. The chaos was thunderous, unstoppable. In contrast to Chris Watts, who lied and manipulated in the aftermath of silence, Chad Doerman confessed almost immediately. His crime was loud, visible, undeniable. Where Chris's daughters died in silence, Chad's sons died in thunder. Both betrayals were absolute. Both destroyed the sanctity of childhood. Chris Watts' betrayal of his family cannot be told without focusing on the daughters who adored him. Bella and Celeste looked at their father with wide eyes, with trust that only children can give. They didn't see the man tangled in an affair, the man who saw them as burdens, the man plotting escape from responsibility. To them, He was simply Daddy, the one who tucked them in, who carried them when their legs grew tired, who was supposed to be the safest person in their world. That is what makes his decision so chilling. He didn't just kill his children. He killed their trust, their innocence, and every bond that defined fatherhood. Bella, the oldest, carried the weight of awareness. At just 4 years old, she had already grown into her role as protector, often looking after Cece with love and patience. Videos show her singing songs to her mother, running into her father's arms, and showing pride in being a big sister. Her spirit was vibrant. Her trust was unshakable. And yet, when her father turned on her, Bella did not go quietly. She resisted. She fought. She cried out against the hands that were stealing her breath. The autopsy revealed the proof. Her tongue injured from biting down, evidence of her desperate fight for air. Bella's courage is one of the most haunting details of this case. In her final moments, she showed more humanity, more strength, more love of life than Chris ever did. To picture Bella's last struggle is to witness the true weight of betrayal. Imagine being a child, recognizing danger, realizing that the man you trust most is hurting you. She must have known. She must have felt the full depth of betrayal. And yet, she fought anyway. Her courage is her legacy. Bella's story is not only about death. It is about her fight for life, a fight that will forever stand as a testament to her will and her strength. Celeste, or Cece, carried the spirit of joy. She was younger, smaller, still wrapped in innocence. To her, life was about laughter, play, and the simple love of family. She clung to her father not because of who he really was, but because of who she believed him to be. She didn't know about lies or affairs. She didn't see the cracks in the marriage. She only saw Daddy. That trust makes her death unbearable. When Chris smothered Cece, she did not resist like Bella. She was too small, too trusting. Her last moments were filled with confusion. Why was her father hurting her? Why had safety disappeared? The cruelty of Cece's death is not just in the act of murder, but in the incomprehension. She died not only in fear, but in the heartbreak of realizing that love had turned against her. Together, Bella and Cece represent two sides of childhood innocence. Bella, old enough to fight, old enough to understand betrayal. Cece, young enough to trust, too young to resist. Both were taken in the cruelest ways. Both died believing in the man who destroyed them. And both remind us that children, no matter their age, are the most vulnerable victims when fathers become killers. And then there was baby Nico, still unborn, still sheltered within Shanann's womb. Nico carried the promise of life yet to be lived. Shanann's excitement was clear in every word she spoke about him. She imagined him joining Bella and Cece, imagined completeness of a family of 5. But Chris did not see Nico as hope. He saw him as a chain, another tie to the life he wanted to abandon. By killing Shanann, Chris killed Nico too. He ended a life that had not yet begun, erasing not only a child but the possibility of a future. The cruelty of killing an unborn child lies in its absolute theft. Nico never breathed, never laughed, never played. He existed only in dreams, in hope, in anticipation. His death reminds us that Chris's crime was not only against those alive, but against the future itself. Nico's name is a marker of possibility destroyed. He represents every moment that will never come, every joy Shanann anticipated but never saw. While the Watts children died in silence, Chad Doerman's sons face a very different horror. Their deaths came with thunder, with gunfire, with the chaos of daylight. Clayton, Hunter, and Chase were not infants. They were old enough to run, to scream, to fight for survival. They were boys with futures, boys with laughter in their voices, boys who should have grown into men. And yet, on June 15, 2023, their father chose to erase them. Clayton, the oldest, carried responsibility. He was the one who guided his younger brothers, the one who instinctively tried to protect them. Hunter, the middle child, was a connector, close to both, sharing bonds that defined their siblinghood. Chase, the youngest, was a spark of innocence, the child adored by his brothers, the light of the family. Together, they were inseparable, defined by the bond of brotherhood. When Chad raised his rifle, that bond was tested in seconds. Reports say one of the boys tried to shield the others, stepping in front in a desperate act of love. That moment captures the essence of their brotherhood. Even in terror, even in the face of bullets, their love for each other defined them. In those seconds, they showed more humanity than their father showed in his entire life. The sound of gunfire tore through the neighborhood. Neighbors heard the screams. Their mother watched in horror as her children were executed before her eyes. Unlike Chris, who lied and manipulated after killing his family, Chad did not hide. His crime was immediate, visible, undeniable. He confessed almost immediately, as though the act meant nothing to him. Where Chris's daughters died in silence, Chad's sons died in thunder. Both betrayals were absolute. Both destroyed innocence. The contrast between silence and thunder tells us something about the nature of evil. Chris tried to disguise his crime, to weave lies around it, to play the role of grieving father. Chad made no such effort. His crime was naked, exposed, announced with gunfire. But for the children, the result was the same. Lives stolen, trust destroyed, futures erased. When we look at these 6 children together, Bella, Cece, Nico, Clayton, Hunter, and Chase, we see not only victims but stories. We see courage, innocence, promise, loyalty. We see children who loved deeply and were loved in return. And we see the betrayal that ended them. Celeste Watts, known as Cece, carried light wherever she went. She was small but spirited, the kind of child whose voice filled a room, whose giggles turned the ordinary into joy. If Bella, her older sister, represented awareness and responsibility, Cece embodied pure childhood innocence. She was only 3 years old, still in that tender space where the world feels safe, where daddy is a hero, where mommy's love makes everything better. Shannon often shared videos of Cece that now ache with meaning. In them, we see a little girl twirling, laughing, sometimes stomping her feet in playful defiance. She was energetic, mischievous, and loving, always orbiting her sister and her parents. Her favorite word seemed to be daddy, a reminder of how central Chris was to her small world. That word, spoken with trust and joy, became the ultimate betrayal when he turned against her. At 3, Cece could not grasp the complexity of adult problems. She didn't know about Nickel Kessinger. She didn't understand the rift growing between her parents. She didn't see responsibility, bills, or broken promises. She saw love. She saw safety. She saw a father who was supposed to protect her. That innocence is what makes her death so unbearably cruel. She could not resist like Bella. She did not recognize danger until it was too late. When Chris smothered her, Cece's final moments must have been filled with confusion. Why was Daddy hurting her? Where was the safety she had always known? That incomprehension is its own form of terror. Cece's story is a reminder that children, especially at that age, cannot defend themselves. They are wholly dependent on the adults around them. Her trust was absolute, and it was shattered in an instant. To picture her last moments is to imagine a child's mind breaking under the weight of betrayal, a child trying to make sense of the impossible. Cece's innocence magnifies the crime. She reminds us that family annihilation doesn't only end lives. It ends trust, it ends safety, it rewrites the meaning of home. And then there was Nico, Shanann's unborn son, her joy, her dream of completeness. When Shannon announced her pregnancy, she glowed. She recorded videos telling Chris how excited she was. She texted friends about baby names, about her hope for the future. Nico represented renewal, a future Shannon believed was secure. For her, Nico was a blessing. For Chris, Nico was a burden. In his warped mind, another child meant another chain, another reason he could not leave Shannon and pursue his fantasy life with Nickel. By killing Shannon, Chris ended Nico's life too. That choice extended his betrayal beyond the present. He didn't just destroy the children who lived in his home. He destroyed the child who had not yet been born, a life that had not yet taken its first breath. Nico never knew laughter. He never cried, never walked, never grew. His existence was erased before it began. The cruelty of that act lies not only in death, but in denial. Chris denied his son every possibility. Shanann's joy turned into the silence of a life cut short. The erasure of an unborn child carries a unique kind of horror. We mourn Bella because she fought, because she resisted, because she showed courage. We mourn Cece because she was innocent, confused, too young to resist. But with Nico, we mourn potential itself. He was a name, a heartbeat, a dream. Shannon loved him fiercely, though she never held him. He symbolizes every future moment stolen. First steps, first birthdays, school days, teenage years, a life that should have been. Chris didn't just murder his unborn son. He murdered the hope of tomorrow. Turning back to Ohio, we find 3 boys who live with different challenges, but who still carried the joy of childhood. Clayton, the oldest, was stepping into his role as protector. At just 7 years old, he had already learned to look out for his brothers. Hunter, only a few years younger, carried the energy of middle child, playful, loud, always ready for mischief. Chase, the youngest at 3, was adored by his older brothers. Together, the boys represented loyalty, laughter, and love. They were inseparable, often seen outside their home, riding bikes, running through yards, shouting each other's names in play. Their bond was clear to everyone who saw them. Clayton's protectiveness, Hunter's energy, Chase's innocence. It was a kind of sibling connection that promises a lifetime of shared memories. Their mother cherished them, pouring her life into raising them. But beneath their joy, Chad Doerman was unraveling. His instability was not hidden. He brooded, he yelled, his temper unpredictable. Unlike Chris, who created a facade of normality, Chad carried his darkness into the open. His children may not have understood the depth of his instability, but they lived with its shadow. On June 15th, 2023, that shadow became thunder. Chad raised a rifle in broad daylight and turned it on his sons. There was no secrecy, no deception, no delay. He acted in front of his wife, in front of neighbors, in front of the world. The boys screamed. They ran. They tried to survive. Reports reveal that one of them, perhaps Clayton, tried to shield the others, stepping forward in a desperate attempt to protect. That single act captures the essence of their bond. Even in terror, their loyalty to each other defined them. The gunfire shattered the afternoon. Neighbors heard the chaos. Their mother's screams echoed through the street as she watched her children fall. Unlike Chris, who spun lies and feigned concern, Chad confessed almost immediately. His crime was undeniable, visible, thunderous. The boys' final moments were not filled with confusion like Cece's or resistance like Bella's. They were filled with chaos, the sharp clarity of terror, the knowledge that death was seconds away. The Doerman boy story is a story of thunder. It is loud, violent, destructive. It tells us that evil doesn't always hide. Sometimes it announces itself with gunfire. Sometimes it shows itself in full daylight. And in doing so, it erases not only lives, but the very idea of safety in the most public way possible. Clayton Doerman was the oldest, and like so many firstborn children, he carried the responsibility of being a guide and protector. At just 7 years old, he already had the instincts of someone who looked out for those smaller than him. He was still a child, yes, but in the way he moved with his brothers, in the way he was often seen leading them, there was something instinctive about his role. Clayton was not just a big brother. He was a shield, a source of comfort, the one who could be relied upon when the others were scared. Children that age rarely think about words like duty or responsibility, but they live them, and Clayton lived them. He took pride in being the one who showed Hunter and Chase how to play, how to share, how to explore. Hunter, the middle child, was different but no less important. Middle children often find themselves balancing both directions, looking up to their older siblings while guiding the younger ones. Hunter was energetic, full of laughter, with that unfiltered joy that comes from being old enough to understand the world a little, but young enough to still see it through eyes of wonder. He laughed with Chase, teased with Clayton, and carried bonds that tied him equally to both. His life was full of potential. He was still forming his sense of identity, still finding where he fit between his brothers. But what was clear was his love for play, for family, for the connection that defined his role. Chase, the youngest, was innocence personified. At only 3 years old, his entire world revolved around his family. He was adored by his older brothers, doted upon by his mother, and even the chaos of Chad's moods, Chase brought joy. The youngest children often become the light of a household, the one who makes others laugh, the one who softens arguments, the one who can get away with things because they are small and cherished. Chase was that child. He was the baby of the family, a spark of light that brought smiles wherever he went. Together, the three brothers represented what it means to grow up surrounded by love. They argued, yes. They shouted and competed and got into trouble like any siblings do. But their bond was unmistakable. They were united. They were a unit. They were building memories that should have stretched into adulthood. Memories of games, secrets, inside jokes, and adventures. They should have been men one day, looking back on their childhood with fondness, maybe laughing about the time they scraped their knees or fought over toys. Instead, their childhood ended in a storm of bullets. On June 15th, 2023, the world shattered for them. Chad Doerman, their father, raised his rifle and pointed it not at strangers, not at threats, but at his own flesh and blood, in broad daylight, in the open, with no mask, no excuses, no attempt to disguise what he was doing. The boys reacted as any children would. They ran, they screamed, they looked for safety. Clayton, with the instinct of protector, reportedly tried to shield his brothers. Imagine the courage it takes, in such a small body, to step forward when terror is closing in. That moment says everything about who he was. It says everything about the strength of children, the strength of love, even in the face of death. Hunter's last moments would have been confusion mixed with fear. At his age, he was old enough to recognize that this was death, that this was violence, that what his father was doing could not be undone. He was young enough, though, to still hope that maybe it wasn't real, that maybe someone would intervene, that maybe his father would stop. The cruel truth is that Hunter's final moments were stolen of hope, stolen of joy, and filled instead with the sound of his father's gun. Chase was the baby. His last moments were likely filled with nothing but terror, unable to understand why his father was raising his voice, raising his weapon, and shattering the world around him. At 3 years old, Chase was too young to process betrayal. He only knew fear, only knew the instinct to cling, to run, to cry out for his mother. His voice, small and desperate, was silenced by bullets. For their mother, the anguish is indescribable. She saw it happen. She saw her children fall. She heard their cries. She witnessed their father erase them in front of her eyes. There are no words strong enough to capture the depth of such pain. The bond between mother and child is primal. To carry a child, to nurture, to feed, to care for them from their first breath, and then to watch them die at the hands of their father. It is an agony beyond comprehension. She not only lost her children, she lost the trust she once had in the man she built a life with. She was left standing in the wreckage of both family and safety. Neighbors heard the screams and the gunfire. They looked out their windows, some running outside, only to be confronted with the horror of 3 young boys lying in the street, their mother screaming, their father holding the weapon that had stolen their lives. It was thunder. It was chaos. It was evil laid bare in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. Unlike Chris Watts, who tried to cover his crime with lies and smiles, Chad Doerman did not even attempt to hide what he had done. His confession came swiftly, almost coldly, as though the act itself carried no weight in his heart. That lack of remorse, that absence of humanity, compounds the crime. What happened to the Doerman boys forces us to confront the darkest questions about parenthood, about humanity itself. How could a father see the faces of his sons, hear their cries, and still pull the trigger? How could he watch them fall and not be broken himself? The truth is that some acts of evil defy understanding. They are not mistakes. They are not lapses in judgment. They are choices, deliberate and cruel. And the ones who suffer most are the children who never had a chance to defend themselves. Clayton, Hunter, and Chase should be remembered not for the way they died, but for the way they lived. They were brothers bound by love, by laughter, by the ordinary joy of growing up together. They were boys who had birthdays, who played games, who argued over toys, who loved their mother and trusted their father. They should have grown into men with lives of their own. Instead, their names are now linked forever to one act of violence, one betrayal that stole everything from them. Their mother carries scars that will never heal. The community carries shock that will never fully fade, and the world carries a reminder that evil sometimes hides in plain sight in the form of a father who should have been their protector. The Doerman boys remind us that children are the truest victims of family annihilation. They did not choose the circumstances. They did not create the problems. They were simply children, loving, trusting, innocent. And that innocence was destroyed by thunder. Shawn Ann Watts woke up on August 13th, 2018, unaware that it would be the last morning of her life. She was exhausted from a work trip, returning home in the early hours after a late flight. For Shawn Ann, the coming days were meant to be about family. She was juggling pregnancy, 2 young daughters, and her business. Her thoughts were filled with excitement for the new baby she carried, a little boy she had already named Nico. She spoke often about how this child would complete her family. In her heart, she was ready to face the challenges of motherhood again with the same strength she had shown for Bella and Cece. But her husband, Chris, had already decided that there would be no future for Shawn Ann or their children. He had spent weeks growing distant, hiding an affair and planning an escape. On that morning, as Shawn Ann lay down in their home, she was unaware that Chris had already turned against her. His betrayal was not spontaneous. It was calculated. It was deliberate. Shawn Ann was not facing an argument, not a marital dispute. She was facing her killer, her husband, and she had no idea. Shanann's final hours are haunting because they are filled with ordinary acts. She texted friends. She entered her home quietly. She carried the weight of exhaustion, pregnancy, and the comfort returning to her family. She trusted that her husband was the partner she believed him to be. And yet, when Chris placed his hands around her throat, her trust ended in violence. Her last thoughts were likely about her children. Bella and Cece were sleeping nearby. Nico was moving inside her womb. Shawn Ann must have realized in her final moments that the man she loved was ending not only her life, but theirs too. The murder of Shawn Ann is tied inseparably to the murder of her children. Chris did not stop with her. He turned to Bella and Cece, smothering them as they cried out for him. He ended Nico's life without hesitation. Shanann's story is one of double betrayal. The betrayal of a husband and the destruction of her children's future. She carried Nico with pride. She loved Bella and Cece with all her heart. She trusted Chris to protect them. And instead, he killed them all. Thousands of miles away in Ohio, another mother lived through a nightmare that was even more direct. On June 15, 2023, Chad Doerman's wife was at home when the unimaginable began. Unlike Shawn Ann, who was attacked in her sleep, Chad's wife was fully awake. She saw her husband raise a rifle. She heard the first shot. She watched her children scream, and she was powerless to stop it. The trauma of that moment cannot be overstated. To see your children gunned down in front of you is to live through a pain that words cannot capture. This mother was not only grieving the loss of her children. She was living with the memory of their final cries, the image of their bodies falling, the sound of bullets echoing in her ears. Her trust in her husband shattered in the most violent way possible. He did not just kill their children. He did it in front of her, as though her anguish was part of his intent. Unlike Chris, who lied, manipulated, and spun a false story for days, Chad confessed almost immediately. But confession is not the same as remorse. Reports describe his admission as cold, detached, almost casual. There was no attempt to deny, no attempt to cover. He simply said what he had done for his wife. That admission must have been salt in the wound. Not only had she lost her sons, she had lost them to a man who seemed indifferent to their deaths. The difference between Shanann's experience and that of Chad's wife highlights two faces of betrayal. Shanann's trust was stolen in silence. She believed in her husband until the very moment he ended her life. Chad's wife lived through betrayal and thunder. She saw it, heard it, felt it. Both mothers suffered the loss of children. Both faced the destruction of their families. But the ways they experienced that loss were brutally different. For Shawn Ann, her last hours were filled with hope for future, only to have that hope crushed by hands of deceit. For Chad's wife, her last moments with her children were filled with terror as she watched their futures end in bursts of violence. One betrayal was cloaked in silence. The other was announced in thunder. Both left scars that can never heal. Neighbors later described the screams from the Doerman house as unforgettable. They spoke of the gunfire that shattered the air, the chaos that rippled through the community. Some tried to intervene. Some could only stand frozen in shock. For the mother who lost her boys, those screams were not just sounds. They were her reality. They were her life breaking apart. She not only lost her sons, she lost them in a way that replayed in her mind every time she closed her eyes. What both women share is the bond of motherhood. Shannon loved her children fiercely. She posted their lives online not for vanity, but to celebrate them, to share her joy. Chad's wife loved her sons with equal intensity, building her days around them, cherishing the bond of siblinghood she saw between them. Both women did what mothers do. They gave, they nurtured, they loved, and both were betrayed by the men who should have stood beside them as protectors. The grief of these mothers reminds us that family annihilation is not just about death. It is about the destruction of love, the erasure of trust, the breaking of bonds that should have been sacred. Shanann's story and the Ohio mother's story show us two versions of the same nightmare. One in silence, one in thunder, both ending with children who will never grow up, never live out the lives they deserved. When the crimes were over, when the silence and thunder had faded, what remained was grief. Not just grief in the abstract sense, but grief that tore through families, communities, and the very foundations of trust. For Shauna and Watts' family, the news of her death and the deaths of Bella, Cece, and Nico was more than devastation. It was disbelief. They had loved Chris. They had trusted him. Shanann's parents had welcomed him into their home, their lives. To them, he was a son-in-law, a father to their grandchildren, a partner to their daughter. When they learned that he had not only murdered Shannon, but also the children, their grief was doubled by betrayal. For Shanann's parents, the pain was unbearable. They lost their daughter. They lost their grandchildren. They lost a future they had dreamed of, birthdays, school plays, graduations, holidays together. They lost a chance to see their grandchildren grow into adults. Every memory they carried of Bella's laughter, of Cece's energy, of Shanann's joy at carrying Nico, became painful reminders of what was gone. Their grief was not just sorrow. It was anger, rage at the man who had taken everything from them. Shanann's friends also struggled with disbelief. They had seen the social media posts, the videos, the family moments. To them, Shannon had been proud of her husband, proud of her children, proud of the life she was building. They couldn't understand how the smiling father in those videos could be the same man who had killed them. For friends, the grief carried confusion, a desperate attempt to reconcile two images of Chris Watts, the family man and the murderer. In Ohio, the grief was louder, more immediate. The day Chad Doerman killed his sons, the entire neighborhood became a witness. Mothers pulled their children indoors. Fathers stood in their yards, frozen in shock. Children asked questions no parent wanted to answer. The sound of gunfire had pierced not only the afternoon air, but the illusion of safety. Neighbors had heard the boys scream. Some had seen them run. Some had seen them fall. Unlike the Watts murders, which were initially cloaked in lies, the Doerman killings were undeniable from the very first moment. For the mother of Clayton, Hunter, and Chase, the aftermath was not only about loss, but about survival. She had seen her children die. She had screamed until her voice was raw, begged for mercy that never came, witnessed every second of their betrayal. Afterward, she had to live with the images burned into her mind. Her grief was not just about absence. It was about memory, replaying those seconds again and again, unable to escape the horror. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her sons fall. Every time she tried to rest, she heard the echo of gunfire. The community around her rallied, but their support could not erase her pain. People brought flowers, food, prayers. They lit candles, held vigils, and spoke the boys' names aloud. But nothing could bring back Clayton, Hunter, and Chase. Nothing could erase the memory of their final cries. The community grieved together, but her grief was personal, singular, a wound that could never heal. In both Colorado and Ohio, the aftermath forced people to confront questions they could not answer. How could a father murder his own children? How could a man betray the trust of his family so completely? These were not strangers. These were not outsiders. These were fathers who tucked their children into bed, fathers who heard them say, "I love you," fathers who were supposed to protect them from a world. The crime shattered the very idea of what family means. For Shanann's family, the trial of Chris Watts was both necessary and unbearable. They had to sit in court and hear the details of how their daughter and grandchildren died. They had to see Chris in shackles, sitting silently, sometimes pretending to show emotion. They had to listen to prosecutors describe Bella's struggle, Cecil's fear, Shanann's last moments. Every word was a knife. Every detail was agony. But they endured because they needed justice. They needed the world to know the truth. For Chad Doerman's wife and family, the process was even more painful because there was no mystery, no lies to unravel. Chad confessed immediately. His guilt was never in question. The community did not need to be convinced. They had heard the gunfire. They had seen the chaos. His wife had witnessed everything. The trial became not about proving guilt, but about reckoning with the absence of remorse. For her, there was no comfort in a confession. There was no relief in truth. She already knew the truth. She had seen it unfold in front of her eyes. The grief of these two families highlights the ways betrayal multiplies pain. Shanann's parents grieved in silence, their trust broken by lies that lasted for days before Chris finally confessed. They were forced to watch him play the role of concerned husband, forced to hear him give interviews while knowing deep down something was wrong. Chad's wife grieved in thunder, with no lies, no delay, no mask. She saw the truth in full daylight, her children gone before she could even comprehend what was happening. Both forms of grief are unbearable. Both reveal the full devastation of family annihilation. Communities struggled too. In Colorado, neighbors were shaken when the truth came out. They had seen Chris standing in his driveway, giving interviews, pleading for Shanann and the girls to return home. They had believed him. Some even defended him in those early days. When the truth emerged, the betrayal extended outward. It wasn't only the family who felt deceived. It was the community, the reporters, the neighbors who had trusted his words. Their grief included shame at having believed a murderer's lies. In Ohio, the community's grief was immediate and collective. People who had seen the boys playing in their yards, riding their bikes, shouting each other's names, now faced silence. The absence of laughter was louder than any gunshot. Parents held their children closer. Children asked why their friends were gone. The entire town became a family in mourning, united by shock, fear, and sorrow. What both cases remind us is that family annihilation does not end with the murders. It ripples outward, destroying families, breaking communities, haunting everyone who comes into contact with the story. Shanann's parents will never heal. Chad's wife will never forget. Neighbors will carry the sound of gunfire in their memories forever. And for the rest of us, the names Bella, Cece, Nico, Clayton, Hunter, and Chase remind us of what was lost. Not just children, but trust, innocence, and the belief that home is safe. When the murders were over, the children gone, and the truth revealed, both Chris Watts and Chad Doerman faced the justice system. But the way each man behaved in those final chapters of their cases was as different as silence and thunder. Their courtroom appearances, their confessions, their presence in front of the world, all revealed the true nature of their crimes and of the men themselves. Chris Watts tried to control the narrative. In the days after the murders, he appeared in front of cameras, speaking calmly, almost rehearsed. He claimed to be a worried husband, a concerned father. Standing in his driveway, he told reporters that he just wanted his family back. He gestured, he paused. He repeated phrases meant to sound natural, but something about his tone felt wrong. His neighbor even told police that Chris didn't seem like himself, that he was too fidgety, too calm, too strange. The mask was slipping even before it was torn away. When Chris was brought into interrogation rooms, his lies grew heavier. He shifted stories, tried to paint Shanann as the one who had harmed the girls, attempted to build scenarios where he could appear less guilty. But detectives saw through him. His body language betrayed him. His words faltered under pressure. And when the polygraph test came, it was the breaking point. Chris failed it almost immediately. The truth could not be disguised any longer. His courtroom behavior reflected the man he truly was, a liar stripped of control. Sitting in shackles, wearing prison uniforms, Chris appeared small, broken. He sometimes cried, sometimes looked down, sometimes seemed detached. His confessions came not from remorse, but from pressure, from the collapse of lies he could no longer hold. To those who watched, Chris's presence was pathetic. He was not a man owning his crime. He was a man cornered by truth. Chad Doerman's behavior was the opposite. He did not attempt deception. He did not stand in front of cameras pretending to grieve. When police arrived, he confessed almost immediately. His words were chilling in their bluntness. He admitted what he had done without hesitation, as though he were speaking about something ordinary. There was no attempt to soften, no attempt to lie. His coldness revealed not honesty, but a lack of humanity. In the courtroom, Chad's demeanor shocked observers. He appeared defiant, sometimes expressionless, sometimes smirking. Reports described him as showing little to no remorse, even as prosecutors described how his children screamed, ran, and died. The details did not move him. The grief of his wife and community did not shift his face. He sat there, the man who had executed his sons, as though detached from the horror he had created. His courtroom presence was not of a broken man, but of an empty one. The difference between Chris and Chad in the courtroom highlights the contrast in their crimes. Chris relied on lies, trying to manipulate perception, trying to play roles until the very end. Chad relied on blunt violence, showing no care for perception, no attempt to mask his actions. One man hid behind silence. The other announced his guilt with thunder. Both paths revealed evil. For the families left behind, the courtroom was both agony and necessity. Shanann's parents had to sit through hearings where their daughter and grandchildren were discussed as evidence, as autopsies, as facts on paper. They had to hear prosecutors describe Bella's resistance, Cece's innocence, Nico's unborn life. Every detail ripped open wounds that could never heal. Yet they sat because justice mattered. Their grief became testimony. Their presence was a reminder that Shanann, Bella, Cece, and Nico were not just names in a case file. They were lives stolen. For Chad's wife, the courtroom was another theater of pain. She had already seen her children die. Now she had to sit in a room where their names were spoken by prosecutors, where their final moments were laid bare, where the man she once trusted sat only feet away. Unlike Shanann's family, who had at least been spared the sight of the murders themselves, Chad's wife carried the images in her mind already. Court did not bring closure. It brought repetition, reliving, re-traumatizing. The public reaction to both cases was enormous. Chris Watts' story spread quickly because of his lies. People watched his interviews, dissected his words, noted his body language. Social media exploded with commentary, suspicion, and eventually outrage when the truth came out. Chris became infamous not only for his crime, but for the way he tried to deceive the world. He became a case study in narcissism, in the danger of facades, in the way lies can collapse under scrutiny. Chad Doerman's case spread for a different reason. There were no lies to unravel, no interviews to analyze. The horror was immediate, undeniable. The story shocked people not because of deception, but because of the sheer brutality. A father had executed his sons in daylight. The bluntness of the act, the coldness of his confession, left people with no room for speculation. It was simply horror. Both cases sparked discussions about family annihilation, about mental illness, about control, about the role of fathers in families. People asked how these men could exist. People asked what signs had been missed. Communities demanded answers that may never come. But what united both stories was outrage, grief, and a determination to remember the children. Because at the heart of these cases are not the men who committed the crimes. At the heart are Bella, Cece, Nico, Clayton, Hunter, and Chase. 6 children who trusted, who loved, who should have been protected. Their names matter more than Chris Watts or Chad Doerman. Their stories matter more than courtroom drama or confessions. They were children. They deserved life. The legacy of these children is carried in memory. For Shanann's family, it is in the video Shanann shared, in the smiles of Bella and Cece, in the ultrasound images of Nico. For Chad's wife, It is in the laughter of Clayton, Hunter, and Chase, in the way they play together, in the memories of their bond. The children's lives, though short, remind us of innocence, courage, loyalty, and love. Their deaths remind us of the depths of betrayal. But their lives remind us of what was good, what was pure, what was worth protecting. That is how they should be remembered, not as victims of murder, but as children who brought joy to the world in the time they had. The media turned both cases into national stories, but in very different ways. Chris Watts became infamous not only for his crimes, but for the lies that surrounded them. Reporters replayed his interviews, noting his forced expressions, his odd body language, the strange way he pleaded for his family's return even as he already knew they were dead. Television hosts debated his motives. Psychologists dissected his behavior, and true crime communities analyzed every word he spoke. For many, the fascination came not just from the horror of his crime, but from the performance he gave, the mask of the grieving husband that cracked within days. Chad Doerman's case struck the public differently. There was no mask to analyze, no deception to pick apart. The horror was immediate, raw, and undeniable. News outlets reported on the shocking reality of a father executing his children in broad daylight, in front of his wife and neighbors. The bluntness of the act left people shaken. There was no time to wonder, no mystery to unravel. The facts were as loud as the gunfire itself. People were left asking not how he had hidden his crime, but how he could carry it out at all. These differences, the lies of Chris Watts versus the blunt confession of Chad Doerman, created two distinct narratives in the media, but both raised the same question: how could fathers commit such betrayals? The cases became cautionary tales, not just about domestic violence, but about the dark potential of family annihilators. Psychologists noted that Chris Watts displayed traits of narcissism, deception, and cold attachment, while Chad Doerman appeared more aligned with sadistic rage, with violent impulses unmasked. Yet in the end, both men reached the same place: prisons stripped of freedom, forever defined by their crimes. Their names are remembered not for any achievements in life, but for the families they destroyed. Their legacies are ones of betrayal, cowardice, and cruelty. But the children's legacies are different. They are remembered for their innocence, their courage, their joy. Bella's bravery in fighting back. Cece's innocence, too young to understand. Nico's promise, never realized. Clayton's protective instincts. Hunter's laughter and bond. Chase's baby-like joy. 6 children who never should have been betrayed. 6 names that deserve to be spoken, remembered, honored. When we compare Chris and Chad, we see 2 faces of the same evil. Chris murdered in silence. He used deceit, manipulation, and control. His crimes were quiet, suffocating, hidden until exposed. Chad murdered in thunder. He used violence, noise, and chaos. His crimes were loud, undeniable, broadcast in the screams of his children and the echo of his rifle. One man tried to play a role, hiding behind lies. The other dropped a mask, revealing his darkness without shame. Silence versus thunder. Lies versus confession. Both paths lead to the same tragedy. Children murdered by their fathers. The contrast shows us a variety of ways evil can manifest, but the result reminds us of what is always lost: innocence, trust, love. For communities, these cases shattered illusions of safety. Neighbors in Colorado could no longer trust the image of the perfect family. Neighbors in Ohio could no longer trust the quiet of a sunny afternoon. Both communities learned that betrayal does not always come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from the people closest to us. For families, the grief will never end. Shanann's parents will carry the loss of their daughter and grandchildren for the rest of their lives. Chad's wife will live every day with the memory of her son's final moments. No courtroom verdict can erase that pain. No sentence can heal those wounds. But for us, for those who listen, who watch, who learn, there is something to carry forward. We must remember the victims. We must speak their names. We must remind the world that Bella, Cece, Nico, Clayton, Hunter, and Chase were more than victims. They were children who laughed, who loved, who trusted. Their lives were short, but they mattered. Their stories deserve to be told, not just as cautionary tales of evil, but as reminders of innocence, love, and the sacred duty of parenthood. In honoring them, We also confront the uncomfortable truth that family annihilation is real, that it can happen anywhere, and that vigilance, awareness, and compassion are our tools against it. By speaking about these cases, we ensure that the victims are never forgotten, and we reaffirm the value of life, love, and trust. So tonight, as we close the story of silence and thunder, let us remember Bella, Celeste, Nico, Clayton, Hunter, and Chase. Let us carry their names in our hearts, not just as victims, but as reminders of what was good and pure in this world. And let us promise never to forget them. If this story moved you, if you believe these children deserve to be remembered, please take a moment to support this channel. Subscribe for more stories where we honor the victims, confront the truth, and explore the darkest corners of human behavior. Your support helps keep these stories alive, ensures their names are never erased, and builds a community that values truth over lies, light over darkness. This has been Dark Truths, True Crime Stories. Thank you for listening, and most importantly, thank you for remembering Bella, Celeste, Nico, Clayton, Hunter, and Chase.